We have our next speaker, Peter McGarry. Peter has been working in the field of occupational health and hygiene for 20 years. He's the Manager of Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, Asbestos and Occupational Hygiene and Health Unit. Prior to taking up this role, Peter was employed as a Principal Advisor in Occupational Health and Hygiene for WHSQ, working in areas including asbestos, hazardous chemicals, particles, noise, vibration, lead and biological hazards. Peter is an Associate Member of the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygiene and has completed a Diploma in Health Science, a Postgraduate Diploma in Health and Safety, Postgrad in Occupational Hygiene, a Masters in Occupational Health and Safety. In early 2016, Peter will complete a PhD within the research area of methods for measuring nanoparticles and other particles emitted by nanotechnology process. So Peter's presentation is about asbestos with a focus on importation. Materials containing asbestos have recently been imported into workplaces in all Australian states and territories, and Peter has taken a leadership role in the development and implementation of the Heads of Workplace Safety Authorities endorsed Asbestos Implementation Rapid Response Protocol, and he has written the content of the fact sheet managing the importation of... Can you finish off for me, Peter? I'll finish. Thank you. Those fact sheets are available on the website. I did print them out as well, but unfortunately I haven't brought them along today, so you probably will be able to find them. If not, I can also email after the event any of the sessions that we've had today, plus that fact sheet. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you to WorkSafe Tasmania for the opportunity to present today. I've primarily been asked to speak about asbestos risk management, particularly with a focus on how do we manage or prevent imported asbestos materials coming into our supply chain. And I'm going to share with you some reasonably practical ways that we can all prevent imported asbestos materials coming into the supply chain. And at the end of the session, if there's time, I can answer general asbestos risk management questions as well. So before I share that information, Pam sort of explained what I do, and I lead a team of technical experts in the area of asbestos and lead risk management and chemical risk management, noise, etc. And it's very important that for the regulation of asbestos that there's a firm technical base to that. But equally important is a multifunctional team. So Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, who are the similar regulator to WorkSafe Tasmania, we take a multifunctional team approach, and our approach to regulating asbestos issues for the community has a firm technical and a firm policy base. And that's really necessary if we're going to sort of interpret legislation and make it doable for the community. To that extent, I'd just like to acknowledge my colleague, Bradley Beck, who's here from our WHSQ policy unit. So today I'm just going to cover the chronology of asbestos use in Australia, some of the key government agencies particularly involved in managing asbestos imports, cover some of the legislation, give you some examples of recent imports of materials containing asbestos. So look, I'd just like to say as an aside that in the totality of all the materials that are imported into Australia, the evidence is that there's only a very small number of materials containing asbestos being imported into Australia. I'm going to just share with you the government rapid response protocol. I'm going to describe some of the key aspects of a guidance document that we've written for businesses about managing asbestos containing materials entering the supply chain, and I'll answer general questions about asbestos risk management. So the brief chronology of asbestos use in Australia. So asbestos was a very versatile product. It was used for much of the last century. It had very useful products. was a very toxic product, so it should be banned as it is, but it had high tensile strength, had very good thermal and electrical thermal insulation properties, and it was very affordable. And for that reason, it's estimated that there's probably about 3,000 or more products worldwide that were manufactured to contain asbestos. And Australia, interestingly, up until the mid-1980s, had the highest per capita use of asbestos in the world. And some of the manifestations of that include that approximately 1/3 of all homes built in Australia during that period contained asbestos. Asbestos, primarily chrysotile and chrysotolite, were actually mined in Australia up until 1984. So chrysotile mining stopped in the early 80s, and chrysotolite at the well-known Wittenoom mine in Western Australia in the 1960s. As well as mining it, we imported quite a lot of asbestos material that we then manufactured into a whole range of products that we still see, particularly in our built environment today. Thankfully, towards the latter part of last century, the laws started recognising the very real toxicity of asbestos, and the laws started progressively prohibiting the use and importation of asbestos. So first of all, the use and importation of two of the more nasty asbestoses, chrysotolite and amosite, were prohibited or banned. Then progressively during the 1980s, the use of chrysotile was phased out, particularly spraying of chrysotile-containing materials. And then finally, on the 31st of December 2003, there was a national ban on the use and importation of chrysotile. So effectively, by 2003, with just a few exceptions, the use and importation of asbestos was banned within Australia. And I'll explain some of those exceptions a little bit later. So there's a whole range of key government agencies who are involved in trying to prevent imported asbestos materials arriving in our supply chain. They include the state, territory and Commonwealth work health and safety regulators, so Safe Work Tasmania are an example, Workplace Health and Safety Queensland are another example. Their role is to regulate and enforce the various work health and safety acts and regulations across the country. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, or the ACCC, has a very important role, and one of their many roles, it's about consumer product safety. The Australian Border Force has an important role, so they have many roles, but one of their roles is to ensure that only legal goods are imported or even exported from Australia. Then there's a range of advisory organisations. So if we start with what we call the heads of workplace safety authorities, or HOWSA. So that's a group that has membership of the state, territory, Commonwealth and New Zealand OH&S regulators, and its primary role is to ensure that there's a consistent application of OHS legislation, enforcement and associated education across Australia. So it represents the attempts for a harmonised OHS system. A subgroup of that HOWSA group is what we call the HOWSA Asbestos Importation Working Group. So the fact that we have such a working group does indicate that, yes, there are known imports of asbestos materials coming into Australia, and the existence of this group reflects the high importance that all Australian governments place on preventing asbestos coming into the supply chain. And one of the primary roles that importation group is to actually facilitate what we call the Asbestos Importation Rapid Response Protocol, and I'll say a little bit more about how that works later on. Then we have Safe Work Australia, So again, they're a Commonwealth agency. They're a coordinating advisory type agency, particularly in relation to ensuring there's consistent application of work health and safety and workers' compensation policy across the country. They are not a regulator. Then we have the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Agency. So again, that's a Commonwealth agency set up a couple of years ago. So it isn't a regulator. It has a role in educating the community about asbestos, and not just in workplaces, but across the Australian community in general. It has a range of other functions, but an important function of ASIA is that it coordinates research activities. So two recent examples of ASIA-inspired research. In 2014, ASIA commenced a research project on developing a common tool for identifying asbestos materials within a workplace in particular. Another key project that, again, they commenced in 2014 was to develop common training materials within the utility sector. So the ban on the import of asbestos. So, as I said before, 31st December 2003 marked the date at which there was a ban on the importation of all asbestos, with just a couple of exceptions, and that ban is enacted under the Customs Prohibited Imports Regulation 1956, so it bans the imports of all types of asbestos, with just a couple of exceptions, and my next slide will outline what those exceptions are. So you can legally import asbestos if it's a raw material that contains naturally occurring traces of amphibole. So amphibole is a collective term particularly for the common chrysotile and amosite asbestos, or chrysotile asbestos. If it's the importation of hazardous waste as defined in the Hazardous Waste Act 1989. If Commonwealth government ministerial permission is granted in accordance with relevant Commonwealth law. If the importation is from the Australian Antarctic Territory for chrysotile only, or if all of the following apply. So it's the importation of a ship or resource installation, and the amphibole or chrysotile asbestos in the ship or resource installation was fixed or installed before the 1st of January 2005, and the amphibole or chrysotile asbestos in the ship or resource installation will not be a risk to any person unless the amphibole or chrysotile asbestos is disturbed. So they're very rare exceptions. So to a large extent, you can't import a material containing asbestos. So work health and safety law. So this is what governs you all as business operators here. So progressively from 2012, most Australian state, territory and Commonwealth governments implemented what we term the Model OH&S Act and Regulation. Now Tasmania and Queensland have implemented those model legislations. So what that means is that for here in Tasmania, the Work Health and Safety Regulation, the asbestos provisions, they indicate that a person conducting a business or undertaking, so that's yourselves, must not allow the following work involving asbestos. That's manufacturing, supplying, transporting, storing, removing, using, installing, handling, treating, disposing or disturbing. Now there are some exceptions for that, and they mainly include if you can legally maintain asbestos that was already in situ. You can remove, dispose and transport if it's allowed under the regulation. Now the regulation logically allows you to legally remove asbestos from a workplace, so long as you do it in accordance with the regulation. And a key example of that is you might get a licensed asbestos removalist in to remove some of your asbestos. Now there have been some rare examples of asbestos being imported into Australia. So I'm just going to share some of those examples with you. So a building site in Sydney in 2015. So you can see the picture here of this sheeting here. So this was discovered, so it was a building site for a residential building. The panels were imported from China. They were thought to be asbestos-free, but subsequent testing by what we call a NATA accredited laboratory, and I'll come back to that key point later, showed that they contained chrysotile asbestos. So the New South Wales OH&S regulator took certain actions to ensure that that asbestos material was removed. Another example relates to motor vehicle parts. So in 2012, the ACCC, so this is where this partnership comes in, commenced monitoring a recall of approximately 23,000 Great Wall and Cherry motor vehicles because some of the engine and exhaust gaskets contained asbestos. So that was probably our biggest importation since 2003. And then in 2015, again, the ACCC commenced monitoring a recall of imported front brakes for certain vehicles. And interestingly, most of these were being supplied or sold through online selling agencies such as eBay. Another example, a recent example, for industrial equipment. So in 2015, the floor sheeting within prefabricated electrical switch rooms manufactured by a South Australian manufacturer were found to contain asbestos. So it's one of the prefabricated rooms there. So the floor sheeting, and so this is a picture here of during the manufacture of the prefabricated building. So this floor sheeting here was imported from China. The switch rooms were supplied to many Australian states, and there was about 64 of them in total were supplied from the South Australian manufacturer to other workplaces across Australia. Another example, in 2012, we found that some imported raw and polished crystals and stones and pennants contained asbestos, mostly chrysotile. You can see here, these are pictures that I took. You can see here, this is polished. Those white seams are chrysotile asbestos. And this is an unpolished raw rock. And you can see the typical fibrous nature of, and this is chrysotile fibres poking up here. So you might be asking, well, what do people do with these crystals? Well, they're marketed as healing stones under the name of chrysotile, which is one of the common asbestoses, and serpentines, and serpentines are more of a generic group that includes chrysotile asbestos. And it's stated readily on the websites that the chrysotile is related to with cleansing, balancing and detoxifying. It serves as an earthing stone for grounding during meditation. You know, some of the other literature indicates it could include curing indigestion, anxiety, depression. We took certain regulatory action to remove these materials from the supply chain. So there have been some prosecutions of people who've been importing asbestos. So this is a prosecution recently published by the Australian Border Force. So in 2014, a 50-year-old Australian man was fined $10,000, required to pay $4,500 costs in the Perth Magistrates Court for importing asbestos into Australia. And the asbestos was found 1,600 gaskets of chrysotile asbestos inside 200 brass constructed chrome-plated hinges. So why are goods containing asbestos still occasionally being imported into Australia? Well, firstly, asbestos is not illegal in a number of countries with whom we trade, China being one example. Local standards in some of these countries may classify asbestos goods as asbestos-free. For example, anything that has less than 1% total asbestos. In Australia, our legislation has a zero tolerance. If it has asbestos in it, doesn't matter what the percentage is, it's an asbestos-containing material. And importantly, there can be incorrect or unreliable certification of the asbestos content. So what should the importer do? So we're getting into the supply chain approach here. So the onus is on the importer to ensure they do not import prohibited goods into Australia. So the importer may do that in conjunction with their broker. The importer should request certification from the manufacturer that the goods are asbestos-free. They should obtain evidence from the overseas supplier, example by the way of product testing, that the material does not contain asbestos. They should arrange for a competent person to sample the goods and materials or have the samples tested by a NATA-accredited laboratory. Suspect goods arriving at the border will be detained by the Australian Border Force and examined at the importer's cost. So the Australian Border Force do have a sophisticated surveillance system at the point of import. So what should businesses such as yourself do? There's no legislative requirement for this, but we would strongly recommend that if you receive imported goods and materials, ask the supplier for an analysis certificate certifying that the material is asbestos-free. Ask for an analysis certificate that's from a NATA-accredited laboratory or an internationally equivalent laboratory. And guidance on this is available on the publicly available fact sheet on managing the importation of goods or materials containing asbestos into Australia. So that is available on the WorkSafe Tasmania website, I believe. It's available on the Workplace Health and Safety Queensland site, and if you put those keywords into the Google search engine, it will also find you that document. So we have set up this, what we call this Government Rapid Response Protocol. So it enables rapid sharing of information between government agencies, so in particular the state, territory and Commonwealth OHS regulators, the ACCC, the Australian Border Force and ASIA. So if one of us become aware that a material containing asbestos has been imported to our jurisdiction, then the Rapid Response Protocol allows that group to come together, particularly if there's evidence that the material is likely to have been imported into other states or territories. So again, that Rapid Response Protocol is a publicly available document. It does take, logically, a risk assessment approach. So the first thing that we require is we get the material tested. Then we'll do a risk assessment. So we'll have a look at what type of material it is, how it is being used, and how likely is it that fibres would become airborne and breathed in. Because the key thing for asbestos is that fibres need to become airborne and breathed in for it to put you at an increased risk of an asbestos-related disease. And then we would determine our response. So what happens if an imported asbestos-containing material arrives at your workplace? So the first thing is do not on-supply the material. Contact your OHS regulators, that'll be WorkSafe Tasmania, and they'll provide you with direction as to what you need to do immediately and what you need to do in the medium to long term. So in summary, there's only evidence of occasional importation of materials containing asbestos. The state, territory and Commonwealth agencies are working together to prevent asbestos materials coming into the Australian supply chain. And the solution does lie in the supply chain approach, right from the importer, broker, right down to at the workplace or business level. There are things that we can all do to minimise asbestos coming in. Information resources. So as I alluded to before, these are readily available on websites, on a whole range of different agency websites. And over to questions. I can answer questions on importation, or my brief is also for asbestos risk management in general. Thank you for your time. Just have to get out of the interrogation lights. They're set right.
The examples of the building materials that were bought, what was the catalyst that caused it to your attention?
Okay. So the question was for the building material, so they were sandwich panels. How did that come to the attention, in this case, of the New South Wales regulator? Well, in this case, there was a very diligent builder who had some experience and thought that the texture or the nature of those materials just didn't look as it should. So it looked quite fibrous, and on subsequent testing, it was found to contain asbestos. Hence the pragmatic advice we provide in the guidance that it's reasonably practicable for you to require of the person supplying you with the imported materials for evidence by way of a analysis certificate that the material does not contain asbestos. That's not an unreasonable thing for you to ask of your supplier. And you can then also decide, as a quality assurance process, you can do your own testing. The cost of doing a test on a piece of material for asbestos averages about $50. So it is a reasonably practical thing to do. It's probably increasingly a reasonable thing to do, and it can potentially save you a lot of problems if you subsequently find that the material contains asbestos. Okay, right, got out of that easy, thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter.